They said her chamber was alive, not with music, nor with prayer, but with the hiss of serpents. Every night a queen, draped in silk and crowned with gold, slipped beneath sheets that writhed and twisted. She did not recoil. She welcomed the snakes, their scales cold against her skin, their coils tightening like ropes of living penance. Courtiers claimed she believed their venom purified her, burning sin from flesh like fire through straw. Servants feared entering her room, yet some swore they saw her smile as fangs pressed against her arm, as if death itself had been invited into her bed. Nobles whispered it was madness disguised as devotion, but still she returned each night, embracing creatures meant to kill her. What kind of faith demands you lie with serpents? And what secret sin was so heavy that only poison could wash it clean? The queen's ritual did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from a soil thick with superstition, penance, and the weight of medieval theology. In her court, priests preached that sin was a stain etched into the very flesh, and that only suffering could burn it away. Whips tore backs, hair shirts rasped against skin. Men starved themselves until their bodies shook, hoping agony might please God. Mortification of the flesh was not strange to them. It was celebrated. But the queen chose another path, one so shocking it froze her court in silence. The first whispers began when a servant ran screaming from her chambers, swearing he had seen serpents gliding across her sheets. At first, no one believed him. Madness was common gossip in courts. But when the queen summoned courtiers to witness, they too saw the writhing bed, snakes coiled like garlands around her body, their tongues flicking inches from her eyes. She lay still, calm, even serene, as though the vipers were a crown more holy than any forged of gold. Some swore they saw her guide them with her hand, stroking their scales, as though they were sacred relics. From that moment, her ritual became infamous. She declared that venom was divine fire, and to let it pierce her flesh was to let God's judgment burn through her sins. Each morning she emerged pale, marked with small bites like bloody rosary beads across her arms and neck. Sometimes her lips were swollen, sometimes she stumbled, unable to walk without a maid's support. Yet she insisted the snakes be returned each night. Her chamber became a pit of sanctified poison, and the keepers of the royal menagerie were ordered to gather serpents daily, feeding her obsession like priests tending an altar. The clergy split into factions. Some argued she was touched by God, a living saint who carried her penance with a bravery no man could rival. Others whispered she was possessed, her piety nothing but a mask for madness. A council of bishops convened in secret, debating whether to denounce her or protect her. But none dared speak against her openly. To call her damned was to risk being condemned themselves. So they watched, silent, while venom replaced prayer, and the queen's bedchamber became a shrine of sin and salvation intertwined. Meanwhile, the people outside the palace grew restless. Markets buzzed with tales of the queen who slept with snakes, mothers warning children not to speak her name aloud at night. Ballads of her ritual spread through taverns, sung in hushed voices by minstrels too curious or too foolish to resist. Some villagers claimed the snakes had multiplied in the countryside as if her devotion had cursed the land itself. Fields turned barren, rivers overrun with adders, and always her name was blamed. She was no longer merely queen, she was a living omen. Among the nobility, fear curdled into reverence. Nobles stopped touching her hand in greeting, yet when she passed, they knelt lower than before. They whispered that her penance shielded the kingdom, that by drawing poison into herself she drew wrath away from them. And so they fed her madness, offering gifts of serpents, presenting gilded cages filled with vipers as though they were treasures. The court, once horrified, began to treat her nightly ritual as a sacred spectacle. They did not stop her. They worshipped her. But imitation proved the most dangerous contagion. Other women, desperate for salvation, were said to slip snakes into their own homes, imitating the queen's devotion in secret. In villages, peasants caught vipers, claiming their venom would cure lust, greed, or envy if allowed to pierce the skin. Some died quickly. Others lingered in fever, praying deliriously before collapsing in silence. Yet the queen's legend grew larger, fed by every corpse, every whispered tale. She was no longer simply a woman who sinned. She was the saint of serpents, the mother of venom, a sovereign who turned poison into prayer. The queen's nightly ritual of serpents soon reshaped the kingdom's very heartbeat. What began as whispered horror became the fulcrum of politics, religion, and fear. Her bed, crawling with snakes, was no longer just a private chamber. It became the throne behind the throne, the true seat of power. Ambassadors from foreign courts traveled under pretense of diplomacy, yet their true purpose was to see her with their own eyes. To some, she was a prophetess. To others, she was a cursed queen, her body already marked by damnation. The rituals themselves grew more elaborate. At first, snakes were simply released upon her bed, slithering across the silk sheets, but soon attendants were ordered to arrange them carefully. Large vipers placed near her arms, smaller adders laid along her legs. Sometimes bowls filled with writhing coils were emptied across her chest, as though baptizing her in scales. Candles were lit, chants whispered by select priests who dared to sanctify the act. Witnesses spoke of nights when she lay perfectly still, as though she herself had become a statue of living penance, crowned not with jewels, but with venom. The court chroniclers, always careful with their words, struggled to describe what they saw. Some called it penance, others dared to name it worship. The queen did not merely endure the snakes, she seemed to command them. Stories spread that no serpent ever struck her fatally, though many bites left scars. Some suggested the venom no longer harmed her, that God, or perhaps the devil, had reshaped her body into something immune. Rumors claimed her blood had thickened into something darker, stranger, so that poison coursed through her veins like sacrament, and so her body itself became part of the legend. Every mark was studied, every fainting fit interpreted like scripture. When she stumbled in procession, people whispered it was because she bore the weight of their sins. When she paled, they said the venom was burning wickedness from the realm itself. And when she smiled, lips trembling, skin marred with bites, the people believed heaven itself had touched her. She had made her body into a canvas for myth, and myths, once believed, were harder to kill than any plague. But her court was not united. Some nobles, tired of fear and superstition, plotted to end the ritual. They argued that every moment she spent among serpents eroded the dignity of the crown, that her madness threatened diplomacy, inviting mockery from enemies. A faction of knights swore privately to remove the snakes by force, to cleanse the palace even if it meant confronting their queen. Yet no plan succeeded. Guards loyal to her patrolled the halls, and any noble who spoke too boldly against her soon fell ill or disappeared, feeding darker suspicions that her serpents served as executioners as well as confessors. The church, too, wrestled with her image. Some abbots wrote letters condemning her as a heretic, while others secretly petitioned the pope to canonize her while she yet lived. Was she holy or damned? A saint of poison or a blasphemer crowned in madness? The debate spread like wildfire through Christendom, pulling the queen into the very center of a theological war. And the queen herself never answered. She simply returned to her serpents each night, as though the opinions of bishops and kings alike were nothing compared to the hiss of her living altar. Her people, caught between awe and terror, began pilgrimages toward the palace. Peasants gathered outside the gates, some holding snakes in wicker baskets, hoping to receive her blessing. Children were pushed forward to touch the hem of her gown, believing a brush of her poisoned skin could heal fevers or grant protection against plague. Merchants sold trinkets carved with coiled serpents, charms meant to mirror her strange devotion. Entire villages fell under the shadow of her image, their prayers mutating into chants that echoed hers. Yet in private, her body bore the toll. Physicians were summoned in secrecy, ordered never to record their findings. They found her blood thin, her heartbeat weak, her skin bruised in patterns too precise to be chance. They warned that one night the venom would not purify her, but kill her. Still, she refused to stop, for in her mind to cease was to invite damnation. Death by poison, she believed, was not death at all, but the final absolution, the opening of a door that no priest could unlock. And so she embraced every coil, every fang, as though each night were her last. Foreign envoys returned to their homelands with conflicting tales. One Italian ambassador wrote that he had seen the queen lying amid snakes as calmly as a mother among her children, calling it proof of divine favor. A German knight, however, swore she was a witch, claiming her eyes glowed in the candlelight as serpents bowed their heads before her. These reports spread across Europe, twisting her into both saint and sorceress. Entire kingdoms debated her sanity. Some feared her influence would inspire cults. Others whispered she had unlocked a mystery no church wished to confront. By now, her nightly ordeal was no longer simply tolerated. It was ritualized. Bells rang at dusk to signal her descent into the serpent bed. Priests processed with incense, their chants echoing through the palace corridors. The snakes were carried in gilded baskets, symbols of her authority as much as her crown. And when at last she lay among them, her people outside the gates knelt in prayer, believing that in every fang that pierced her flesh, their sins were being carried away into her body. The queen had turned poison into liturgy and her body into scripture. The queen's reign entered its darkest chapter when her serpent ceased to be merely her penance and became the machinery of her rule. Where once her chamber alone bore the hiss of scales, Soon entire wings of the palace were given over to serpent keepers. Dozens of men were employed to catch vipers in the forests, cobras in imported crates, and even monstrous constrictors brought from distant lands by merchants who saw her obsession as a profitable trade. The palace that had once resounded with lutes and feasts now echoed with rattles and hisses, its marble halls perfumed not with incense alone, but with the musk of reptiles. Night after night, the ritual grew more elaborate, no longer a private torment, but a performance. Courtiers gathered outside her chamber doors, kneeling as the snakes were carried past them in golden baskets. Priests in jeweled robes burned incense, their chants rising like smoke to the rafters. Servants trembled as they released the serpents upon her bed, each one placing the creatures as carefully as relics upon an altar. And always the queen lay waiting, her body pale, her arms bare, eyes wide and fixed, as though she were both victim and priestess. The effect on her kingdom was profound. Farmers abandoned their fields to join pilgrimages toward the palace, carrying serpents in clay jars as offerings. In villages, cults sprouted like weeds. Men and women gathered in barns lit only by torches, surrounding pits filled with snakes, chanting the queen's name as though she were already divine. Some allowed themselves to be bitten, believing death in her name was a sure path to salvation. Others survived and claimed visions, dreams of the queen standing in fields of serpents, her arms spread wide as if welcoming the world into her coils. The nobility, though horrified, found themselves powerless. To oppose her was to invite ruin, for her legend had seeped into every crack of the realm. Her people saw her as the serpent queen, chosen by God, and nobles who dared whisper against her were branded faithless, their estates burned by peasants who called themselves her disciples. Political rivals were undone not by armies, but by rumors that the queen had marked them for the snakes. And when those nobles inevitably fell ill, assassinated, or simply vanished, the people nodded knowingly. The serpents had done their work. Foreign courts watched in terror. Chronicles from France describe ambassadors who fled her presence, swearing that snakes writhed beneath her throne during audiences. Italian merchants spread tales of her venomous miracles, claiming she could heal or curse with a single touch. Letters to the Pope pleaded for intervention, but Rome hesitated. To condemn her outright was to risk rebellion among the faithful, who already saw her as a living saint. And so Europe remained paralyzed, half in awe, half in fear, watching as her cult bled across borders like poison through a wound. Inside the palace, her health faltered further. Physicians begged her to relent, but she waved them away. Her arms were riddled with scars, her veins blackened where venom had seeped again and again. At times, she collapsed in mid-speech, servants rushing to lift her frail body. Yet when she awoke, her first words were always the same: "Bring the serpents." No absence, no weakness could sever her from them. She had fused her reign and her rituals so tightly that to end one was to end the other. Her crown no longer rested on her brow. It coiled across her skin. Legends multiplied as her condition worsened. Some claimed that when she bled, her blood was tinged green, as if serpent's venom had remade her. Others swore they saw snakes bow their heads in silence when she entered, as if acknowledging her as one of their own. The palace chroniclers, fearful for their lives, recorded every word in careful script, embellishing her miracles, shaping her into myth. The myth eclipsed the woman, and soon none could remember where devotion ended and delusion began. She was not merely a queen, she was the embodiment of poison and purity, destruction and salvation. The danger reached beyond the palace walls. Entire sects began wandering the countryside, calling themselves children of the Serpent Queen. They demanded tithes of livestock, claiming it would feed the serpents that guarded her. They seized churches and repainted icons, replacing saints with images of her lying in coils of snakes. Some carried venomous serpents with them, unleashing them into markets as demonstrations of their queen's holy terror. Panic spread, but so too did belief. She had become a religion with fangs. Diplomacy crumbled under the weight of her legend. Envoys who mocked her were sent home in silence, their bodies convulsing days later, as if cursed. Enemies who threatened invasion found their soldiers unwilling to march against her, muttering that no army could defeat a queen who had already conquered death night after night. Even within her own court, loyalty shifted not to her crown, but to her serpents. Nobles gifted her with rare breeds from across the world, hoping her favor would protect them from her wrath. And always at the heart of this spiraling storm was the queen herself, shrinking into frailty even as her myth grew monstrous. Her body wasted, her lips darkened, Her hands shook with tremors. Yet when the snakes were poured across her chest, she smiled, as if pain itself had become the only language she still understood. Witnesses swore that her eyes glowed in candlelight, that her voice deepened into tones not human. Whether it was illness or something darker, none could say. But all agreed, the queen they served was no longer entirely mortal. Her final transformation in the eyes of her people was complete when famine struck the land. Crops failed, rains drowned the fields, and hunger spread. Yet instead of cursing her, the peasants declared it a sign. She was bearing their punishment herself, drawing the venom of heaven into her body so that the land could one day heal. The worse she looked, the stronger their faith became. By the time winter fell, tens of thousands whispered prayers not to Christ, nor to the saints, but to the queen lying in a bed of serpents. Chroniclers from abroad wrote with dread. One scribe in Prague declared her the most dangerous woman in Europe, not for armies she commanded, but for the fever of belief she inspired. Another in Florence claimed her cult was more venomous than her serpents, a plague of faith that could topple nations. And within her own walls, her attendants swore she no longer slept at all, that she lay awake, eyes open, as snakes coiled across her chest in endless procession, whispering secrets only she could hear. They said she spoke back to them in a tongue no scholar could recognize, a hiss-laden language that made even priests shudder. Some attendants claimed snakes were now born within the palace itself, slithering from corners and shadows to find her bed, as though drawn by blood no longer human. Her chambers became a place few dared enter. Even guards refused to cross the threshold, leaving food outside the doors, knowing that within lay a queen who was no longer fully of their world. She had passed into myth while still breathing, a sovereign alive in body, but already belonging to death. The queen's grip upon her realm reached a fevered peak, and with it, the cracks began to widen. Where once devotion had bound her people, now terror began to gnaw. The cults that hailed her as divine had multiplied, but so too had their violence. Villages reported killings performed in her name. Peasants found with snake bites on their necks, their bodies laid out as sacrifices. Priests who resisted were dragged from churches, their sermons drowned in chants of hissing voices. The children of the Serpent Queen grew bolder, demanding tribute from towns, their zeal unchecked by law or crown. Within the palace, her attendants lived in dread. Servants no longer dared to touch her bedchamber. Those forced to carry in the serpents often returned pale, some collapsing in seizures days later. Rumors spread that the snakes themselves had grown unnatural, larger, darker, more vicious, their eyes reflecting torchlight with an eerie red glow. Some swore the queen had birthed them, that they were no longer ordinary creatures, but spawn of her body. Whether truth or terror, the story spread, feeding the legend until it devoured reason itself. Foreign rulers, once hesitant, began to plot. Her legend was too dangerous, her cult too contagious. If her faith spilled over borders, it could ignite rebellion across Christendom. Letters between kings spoke not of alliances or trade, but of how to contain her myth. Some urged crusade, others assassination. Yet all knew the danger of making a martyr. For every attempt to silence her only risked making her voice louder, her image sharper, her cult more unshakable. She was not merely a queen, she was an infection in the body of Europe, and all the while her body deteriorated. Physicians recorded that her pulse grew faint, her flesh mottled with dark patches where venom had rotted the veins beneath. Some nights she convulsed for hours, her attendants powerless to help. And yet, when her breathing steadied, her first command was always the same: bring them back. She was trapped in the cycle she had created, unable to rule without her serpents, unable to live without their venom, unwilling to die without their embrace. The woman was gone. Only the ritual remained. The climax came when famine and plague struck together. Crops lay rotting, rats overran towns, and pestilence swept through villages. The queen's followers declared it proof that the world itself was poisoned, and only she could draw out its sickness by offering her flesh each night. Tens of thousands gathered at the palace gates, begging to see her, to touch her, to be bitten in her stead. Soldiers could not hold them back. Some broke through, and within the halls of the palace, peasants dropped to their knees, stretching out arms in desperate worship. The queen herself, wasted and skeletal, appeared before them only once. Carried on a litter, her body draped in silk, she raised her arms as snakes writhed across her shoulders. Witnesses claimed her skin glistened like scales in the torchlight. She spoke no words, only hissed, and the crowd erupted into screams of ecstasy and terror. Many swore the snakes lifted their heads in unison, as if saluting their mistress. For the people, it was confirmation of her divinity. For the court, it was confirmation of their doom. The queen's kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse, yet her ritual endured. By now, her bedchamber had become a sanctum none entered willingly. Those commanded to bring serpents inside crossed the threshold as though stepping into a tomb. They described the air as heavy, thick with musk and incense, the floor alive with slithering shapes. Some swore the walls themselves seemed to shift with scales in the flickering torchlight. And there in the center lay the queen, her body shrunken, her eyes wide, her lips cracked, yet still she beckoned for more serpents. Her closest attendants left secret testimonies, recorded in hidden letters that survived long after her reign. They wrote of nights when she ceased to breathe, only to gasp back to life, as if venom itself had become her sustenance. They told of snakes coiling at her throat without striking, as though obeying her unspoken command. One maid claimed to see her tongue flicker like a serpent's, another that her pupils had narrowed to slits. To the faithful, these were miracles. To the fearful, they were signs she was no longer entirely human. Meanwhile, her cult outside grew uncontrollable. Entire towns fell into chaos, ruled not by sheriffs or priests, but by self-proclaimed prophets who claimed to speak in her name. They demanded sacrifices of livestock, of crops, even of human lives. Mothers offered infants to the serpents, begging for protection. Fathers slit their own arms, letting venomous fangs pierce them in imitation of their queen. Bodies piled in the fields, and still the people believed. For if their queen endured the poison each night, how could her followers do less? Foreign powers now conspired openly. Envoys carried daggers hidden beneath robes, hoping to pierce her heart before her serpents could strike. Assassins crept through corridors, only to be found dead, their bodies swollen with bite marks. Some claimed the queen no longer needed guards. The snakes themselves protected her, striking down any who meant her harm. Rome finally broke its silence, branding her a heretic and demanding her destruction. Yet the Pope's decree only fanned the flames, for her followers cried that the church feared her holiness. And through it all, the queen herself seemed caught between worlds, half woman, half myth. At audiences, she scarcely spoke, her voice a whisper drowned by the hiss of serpents at her feet. But when she did, her words were chilling. Your sins are mine. Your pain is mine. Your death is mine. Witnesses recorded the crowd collapsing in sobs, kissing the ground before her. Even nobles, once defiant, bent their knees in terror. The crown upon her head mattered less than the serpents at her side. They were the true symbol of her reign. In her final months, her condition became unbearable to behold. Her skin, once pale, turned mottled and gray. Her hair thinned, falling in clumps across her pillow of writhing bodies. She no longer walked unassisted. She was carried everywhere, draped in silk to hide the decay beneath. And yet, when night came, she still demanded the serpents. No illness, no suffering, no deathly weakness could sever her from her chosen path. She would end as she had lived, swallowed by coils, purified by venom. Her death did not arrive with thunder or war. It came quietly, in the same bed that had defined her reign. One night, attendants entered and found her still. The serpents lay coiled across her chest, their tongues flicking lazily, but her eyes were open, glassy, unblinking. She had not struggled. She had not cried out. It was as if she had slipped willingly into their embrace, letting venom claim her as its final bride. The queen who had made herself a martyr of serpents was gone, yet her legend did not die with her. Her body was entombed not in a coffin of stone, but in a chamber where serpents were sealed with her, their writhing forms meant to guard her for eternity. Some chroniclers wrote that the snakes consumed her flesh until only bones remained, coiled in endless knots. Others swore her body never decayed at all, preserved by venom, resting in silence like a saint's relic. Whichever tale was true, her burial became as contested as her life. Was she damned, or had she ascended into something beyond human? The arguments outlived her reign, fueling centuries of division. But death did not end her reign, it transformed it. Across the land, pilgrims continued to flock to her tomb, whispering prayers to the Serpent Queen. Some brought offerings of snakes, hurling them into the crypt as acts of devotion. Others claimed visions when they touched the stones of her resting place, swearing they felt her breath, her hiss, her eyes upon them. Her cult did not fade with her last breath. It grew, stretching across borders, poisoning faith like venom in water. Priests denounced it, yet still the people believed. The true terror was not what she had done, but what she had shown. That faith and madness, once entwined, are impossible to separate. That suffering can be mistaken for salvation. That a queen lying with serpents could be worshipped as holy. The people did not remember the frailty of her body, the collapse of her kingdom, or the ruin of her reign. They remembered only her devotion, her ritual, her image of purity forged in venom. And so the story survived, not as a warning, but as a prayer. Even centuries later, mothers whispered her name to children, warning them not to wander where snakes gathered. Yet in secret, some still left offerings, hoping the serpent queen might bless them. The church erased her from its records, but her legend thrived in shadow. For legends, like serpents, never truly die. They shed their skin and return anew. And perhaps that is the final sting of her tale, that what seems monstrous to one age may be sanctified by the next. That devotion, however twisted, can outlive reason. And that somewhere in the darkness of faith unbound, another ruler may one day find comfort in coils, seeking purity not in prayer, but in poison. For legends such as hers never truly end. They only shed their skin and wait to be born again.